He had the kind of laugh that bounced off polished brass and linoleum. To the Admiral, it echoed like authority. He walked the corridor with the soft, unavoidable certainty of a man used to being obeyed. The base hummed around him, fluorescent lights, the faint thrum of generators, the distant clank of a coffee cup in a galley. On his way to the strategy room, he spotted the janitor leaning against a mop sink, wiping his hands on a towel, watching a muted newsfeed on a cracked phone. "What's your code name, son?" the Admiral asked, one eyebrow arched, the question half a joke and half a test. He liked to keep people on their toes. It made command look easy. The janitor looked up slowly, the corner of his mouth lifting just enough to be measured as a smile. He had the weathered face of a man who'd seen more winters than the badge on his chest suggested. He set the towel down, straightened his back, and replied, "Lone Eagle." The Admiral's laugh was warmer now. "Lone Eagle, that's a tall order for a mop bucket." There was a ripple through the hallway, officers glancing over with mild curiosity. The janitor didn't flinch. He moved with a quiet economy, the kind that came from doing the same thing for years, sweeping, polishing, making things right again. He picked up his mop, pushed it into the corner, and watched the Admiral walk on, the sound of polished shoes receding. It became a small ritual. The Admiral, looking for a moment of levity in the choreography of high command, would toss the phrase out as he passed. "How's Lone Eagle today?" He'd call back, and the janitor would answer with the same steady calm. Other people began to notice. Some found it amusing. Others found it incongruous. The idea that someone who emptied trash cans could claim a name that sounded like it belonged on a declassified file. Weeks later, something changed. Orders came down that dinged like thunder. A visiting delegation, a little-known arms contractor, a late-night meeting in the Admiral's private office. The base tightened. Walkways that had been casual became checkpoints. Security badges flashed more often, and the smell of worry hung heavy in the air. On the night the lights felt a degree colder, the Admiral stayed late, poring over maps and reports. The strategy room hummed under his command insignia. He was alone except for an aide who hovered somewhere near the doorway, eyes on a tablet, and the janitor, who had been sweeping the outer corridor. The janitor moved as if he owned no hurry, his mop whisked like a metronome. At midnight the base switched to the after-hours cadence. Lights dimmed, voices reduced to radio murmurs, the world narrowed. Then the alarms came, not the loud, bass-waking sirens of a major breach, but a clipped, urgent chirp on the Admiral's earpiece. A motion sensor had gone off in a secured wing. Foot traffic was diverted, red lights marked routes like veins of warning. The aide's face paled. The Admiral rose and barked crisp commands, boots hitting the floor in time with his heartbeat. "Secure the perimeter. Lockdown protocols Alpha. Do not engage unless authorized. Contact the watch." It happened so fast that for a second the room moved in slow frames. Outside, somewhere in the maze of corridors, boots thudded. The base came alive like something waking from a long velvet sleep. The Admiral's jaw tightened. He was about to step out when the janitor placed a hand on the doorframe. "You need me to sweep the west corridor, sir?" he said. The Admiral blinked. "We have security teams. You—" "They don't know the patterns," the janitor said softly. "I know the pipes. I know the vents. I know where the cameras wink out." His voice was calm, no hint of the humor he'd used before. There was depth there now, a kind of weathered steadiness that made the Admiral look at him properly for the first time. It was ridiculous to consider. A janitor's job was to keep things clean, not to parse tactical anomalies. But there was an old, magnetic certainty in the janitor's eyes. The Admiral, who had spent a life listening to gut instincts that saved lives, felt something thread through him. Memory, recognition, a misplaced reckoning. "Stay here," he ordered. "You'll slow things down." The janitor shook his head once, small and precise. "You don't want me to slow things down, Admiral. You want me to fix the noise." Against protocol, the Admiral found himself handing over a keycard. The security team's voices bubbled through the comms, coordinated, competent. Still, the Admiral watched the janitor move out, the mop slung like an afterthought. Officers glanced, some with open amusement, others with a question like a held breath. He walked the west corridor like someone walking through an old neighborhood, a nod to the vents, a touch to a wall seam, an inspection that had nothing to do with janitorial duty and everything to do with memory. He paused by a maintenance hatch and crouched, fingers skimming the metal in a way that suggested familiarity, not just routine access. He pushed the hatch just an inch, then another. It yielded with a reluctant groan. Down the corridor, a door clicked, too precise, too quick. The sound wasn't mechanical, it was human. The janitor's face hardened. He pressed something into his palm, an old brass key or a shard of memory turned to tool. He slipped into the shadows like someone who had always been comfortable with them. Inside the security control room, the Admiral watched screens that showed grainy feeds of corridors and angles. He watched a figure step into a muted camera view. Not an officer, not an intruder in the usual sense, but a maintenance contractor that should have been cleared. He watched with the growing weight of a man who realizes a joke landed somewhere it shouldn't have. Seconds later, his phone buzzed. The aide's voice crackled. "Admiral, we've got 2 unknowns. They're moving towards the logistics bay. Security is intercepting." "Intercept," the Admiral repeated. But the janitor was already gone from the camera, the feed showing nothing where he'd been. He moved on instinct, faster than many men half his age could manage. He took the staircase 2 at a time, then another, the base folding into itself. When he reached a junction between the logistics bay and the laundry wing, he stopped. There was a hush that came down like the held breath of a crowd waiting for a verdict. Then he saw him, the janitor standing with backpack slung over one shoulder, mop in hand, the posture of a man who wasn't going to be sick of doing the same job he was born to do. 2 figures approached, sharply dressed, their manner more confident than practiced. A glint of circuitry at a wrist, a soft hiss of communication. They moved like men who thought they had the place timed. "Hold it right there," the Admiral barked, his voice slicing across the concrete. The 2 men turned. One reached for something inside his jacket. The janitor stepped forward like a metronome, measured, unfazed. "I'm Lone Eagle," he said, and there was no jest now. The name landed like a coin dropped in a still pool. One of the men smiled with the arrogance of someone who mistook softness for weakness. He moved too quickly. Everything after that snapped into a different reality. The janitor didn't flinch. He moved like a shadow refining itself into shape. A knee, a wrist, a hand. Small precise movements that read like choreography. He didn't draw a weapon. He used the men's momentum, the way their weight betrayed them when they expected to compress another man's will into submission. In seconds, both men were on the ground, breathing hard. The cartridges from a concealed weapon skittered at their feet like dead insects. The Admiral felt something freeze in his chest, part fear, part awe. He had seen similar moves in rooms stitched into classified histories. The snap of a hand that could shut down a threat without blood. He realized in a single electric moment that the man before him had moved with the authority of someone who'd made his whole life in the space between danger and control. "Who are you?" the Admiral asked, voice thin. The janitor rose, steady as a tide. He looked at the restrained men and then at the Admiral. He said, "I used to be Lone Eagle for real. Before I was nobody's headline. There it was, a truth too heavy for the fluorescent light to disguise." The Admiral had heard of Lone Eagle, the whispered legend of an operator who worked outside the lines, a man who had chosen missions when they were smallest but mattered, a ghost in the record books. The idea that such a man could be pushing a mop made the Admiral's mouth dry. "Why," the Admiral began, and stopped. Protocol, regulation, career, words that had defined his life, felt brittle. He had joked, and in the wake of that levity found the hush of something he hadn't accounted for, humility. The restrained men swore, words landing like knives. Security teams moved in, their boots heavy, their hands efficient. The Admiral watched the janitor turn his back and sweep the floor as if nothing had occurred, as if the mop was an anchor securing him to a life he had chosen. Later, in the Admiral's office, the man who had once been Lone Eagle sat across from the Admiral at a small table. He had refused clean rooms and fancy messengers. He preferred quiet honesty. He told the story in pieces, the way old lives often do. Snatches of recollection that fitted together like a map. He had not always been a janitor. He'd been a leader in the field, moving through missions that never made paper trails. He had watched comrades die in the glare of impossible choices, and survived the way some men survive when they shoulder other people's burdens. War does things to a man. It rearranges the furniture of the soul. Once, after a mission that settled wrong in his bones, he decided to fold the uniform into a drawer and walk away. No parades, no medals, no fanfare. Only quiet spaces where he could think and work and clean surfaces until they matched the order he wanted inside himself. "Why here?" the Admiral asked. The man looked at his hands, the knuckles white from too many scrubs. "Because this place is full of people who live in boxes. I thought I could keep their boxes tidy, keep them from bumping into the things they put off. I thought if I took away the mess, maybe they'd see something different." His voice was low, and there was no self-pity, only the steady logic of someone whose life had been about mission outcome, not moralizing. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" the Admiral asked. The question was not curiosity alone, it was the weight of a leader who knew the value of truth. He shrugged, a small, graceful movement. "I told one man," he said, "if you wanted to be recognized, you'd still be out there. I didn't want recognition. I wanted to be small enough to do a different kind of good." The Admiral poured 2 cups of coffee, hands slightly unsteady. He'd commanded operations where men moved faster than rumor, where intelligence came in bits and sometimes truth was the thing most absent. He recognized the stubborn choice to vanish from glory. It took a particular kind of courage to walk away. "Why did you freeze them?" the Admiral asked, not meaning the word literally, but feeling the way the act had arrested him. The janitor smiled a little, the ghost of something that belonged to the field returning for a moment. "Because they moved like they were already winners. Because when you deal with men who think the world owes them, the right thing is to remind them it isn't as easy as they think." He paused. "Because there were people who couldn't be allowed to find a way into this place." The Admiral thought of all the times he'd joked, the small barbs he'd thrown to measure the room. He felt suddenly like a man who'd been playing with fire and discovered someone else's ashes in the gutter. He realized that in his jokes there had been a blindness, an unwillingness to look at the edges where people lived with quiet dignity. He made a decision then, not because it was strategic, but because it was human. He could have launched a round of questions, demanded explanations, called in committees to sift loyalty and compliance into tidy piles. But he saw the man's hands, calloused not from fighting but from labor, and he understood that respect could be given now without ceremony. "Come by the mess on Friday," the Admiral said. "Tell me about one mission. I won't make a report of it." The janitor looked at him, and something in his face softened like thawing glass. "I don't do stories for dinner. I do them for the ones who need to hear. But I'll tell you one." He stood and motioned to the mop. "But first I'm on the midnight shift. Word spread as it does on bases, in halls, in shared cigarettes on the perimeter. People began to see the janitor differently. The Admiral started to look for him when he passed. The joke stopped, replaced by nods. The janitor kept sweeping. He continued to sweep even after the contractor men were led away, their faces the stink of overreaching. On Friday, the Admiral sat in the mess, a steaming plate between his hands. The janitor joined him, not as a guest but as a man at the same table. The room smelled of coffee and hash browns, the kind of ordinary warmth that dissolves pretension. He told one mission, and when he did, he stripped nothing away. He spoke of nights in deserts that tasted like dust, of men who trusted him with their last words, of decisions that never got a headline. He said the things men sometimes say when they're not trying to make themselves small, when they just want to make sense of what they survived. The Admiral listened, the muscles in his jaw moving, his hands folded. When the story ended, there was a silence like a held breath. People looked at the janitor with a new attention, the kind that recognizes hidden volumes inside a single, ordinary life. "Why a janitor?" someone asked. "Because curiosity is a human failing and a human virtue." The man looked at the questioner and smiled. "Because I learned it's easier to clean than to explain why something is messy. Because if you hold a broom, you can make someone else's path easier. Because sometimes you want to be useful in a way that doesn't require applause." The Admiral thought of awards and parades and a lifetime of order. He found the logic of the janitor's life compelling. There was something radical about the choice to be small and meaningful rather than large and empty. After that, things changed, not in the headline way that makes newspapers, but in the small archive of a base's days. The Admiral sought his opinion on logistics, and sometimes they'd talk about strategies, not ones that made generals shine, but ones that kept men alive. The janitor's clearance remained low profile. He did not move back into the spotlight. He declined offers of formal reintegration into any unit. That life was for its time, he said. This life is for now. People who had once laughed at the name Lone Eagle began to use it with a reverence that was almost shy. Children of officers asked for the janitor's help fixing a model plane. Old veterans came by to share a cigarette on the loading dock, talking in the short, raw sentences that men used to measure each other. He never talked about why he had left. He made no speeches. He simply did the work he believed mattered, keeping floors clean, fixing a broken hinge, listening when someone needed to talk. Months later, an inspection team came through. They were impressed by the order of things, the efficiency, the morale. The Admiral stood at attention in a proper suit and recited the metrics that mattered to committees. Later, alone, he walked the corridors and found a mop bucket in a corner. He smiled. There were nights when the janitor would walk the perimeter alone, looking at the horizon as if seeing something only he could see. The Admiral would watch from his office window sometimes, his silhouette against the light. He thought about the joke that had started it all, a passing, thoughtless jibe about a code name, and felt a gratitude that unsettled him in the best way. It was a small reminder that the world contained more stories than his map had ever held. Then one evening, lights down, the janitor's mop leaning against the wall, he paused at the Admiral's door. He didn't knock. Instead, he leaned there, listening to the muted rustle of paper and the occasional murmur from radios. The Admiral looked up. "You ever think about going back?" he asked, voice low. The janitor considered. "Sometimes. Not because I miss the danger, because I miss the people." The Admiral thought of the men he'd given orders to, the ones who'd returned and the ones who hadn't. There are people who would argue this place needs you the way it used to. He shook his head once. This place needs people who know how to make it livable, not just survivable. Besides, I've got a broom. He grinned then, and it was quick and honest. And some days that's everything. They both laughed, and for a long moment the corridor felt like it had always been a place where the right thing was possible. A year later, a medal appeared quietly in the Admiral's drawer. No ceremony. A small, unannounced commendation for exceptional vigilance in a critical incident. The janitor never asked for it, never wore it. Once the Admiral slipped it in a pocket and left it by a broom closet door like a small private thanks. The man took it and left it on a shelf, where no one would parade it, because he had no appetite for trophies. On a winter night, when the base smelled of salt and the sky was the black color of an insect wing, a young officer who had been there the night of the breach found him by the mop sink. She asked the question every new recruit asks when they meet someone who has seen too much. "Did you ever regret it?" He looked at her, the lines of his face softening like paper creased and smoothed. "Regret is a heavy thing. I prefer to call it learning." She nodded, satisfied with the kind of answer that fits both lives and ranks. The janitor pushed his mop into its corner and walked out into a night that was not empty but full of small lights. Barracks windows, the distant flicker of a radio, the beam of a guard's flashlight. Sometimes the Admiral would speak the name Lone Eagle when he passed on the way to meetings. It was no longer a joke. The phrase had weight. It meant something like courage and something like humility. The Admiral understood now that men were not always what they appeared to be, and that humor could be a blindfold if led by habit rather than by care. Years later, when the Admiral's own days of command came to a close, he left his office the last time not with swagger but with a slow, honored step. He found the janitor polishing a brass plaque, the motion sure and unhurried. He stood and watched, and when the janitor looked up they both understood the same thing without saying it. "Thank you," the Admiral said. The man set the rag down, meeting the Admiral's eyes with the same clarity that had frozen him the first time. "You kept your station," he replied. "That's enough." They shook hands then, two men who had traded the lightest and heaviest parts of themselves. There was respect between them now, uncomplicated as a clean floor. The janitor kept sweeping long after the Admiral had left the base. People told stories about a man who'd once been something else. Some exaggerated, some trimmed the facts like hedges. In the end, it didn't matter what people called him. He had chosen his life, and in it had found a way to steer other people's days gently back towards order. And when a new Admiral walked those halls years later and asked, as a joke, "What's your code name?" a young officer, who had heard the old stories, would only smile and say, "Lone Eagle." The joke had landed differently now. It wasn't a test, it was recognition. It was the kind of small human thing that makes an impossible place feel for a moment, like home.